Snow came down hard over the East River, the night Cassius Thorne was supposed to die, and the man they called the Undertaker had never once imagined that the hand pulling him out of the wreckage would belong to a tired waitress with $19 in her apron. He was 37, 6'3" of cold muscle, wrapped in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, the dawn of an empire that owned half the shipping containers moving through the tri-state ports. A man whose own people whispered that he'd buried more enemies than the city had cemeteries. He had no softness left in him. Not since the woman he'd loved was taken from him 6 years before, and somewhere along the way his heart had turned to something harder than the steel his crews welded down at the docks. Maeve Donnelly had never heard his name. She was 27, a nursing student who dropped out one semester short of her degree, when her father's stroke swallowed everything they had, and now she poured coffee on the graveyard shift at a diner in East Harlem and walked home in the snow because the subway cost more than she could spare. She still carried a small nightingale pin in her apron pocket, the last proof of the nurse she never got to become. So when an armored Escalade came screaming off the overpass, when 2 black SUVs sat idling without ever stepping out to help, when she heard a stranger's voice crackle over a radio saying "let it burn" and make sure he's finished, every instinct in her body told her to run the other way. She ran toward the fire instead. She dragged a 90-kilo stranger out of a smoking car with glass tearing her arm open, and 3 seconds later the Escalade went up like a struck match, the heat throwing them both flat against the wet asphalt. But the truly impossible part came later, under the fluorescent lights of a hospital his own people controlled. When Cassius Thorne lay fading from blood loss, with a wound no surgeon could close fast enough, and a blood type so rare that no bank in the city could match it, Maeve looked at the panicking doctors, rolled up her bleeding sleeve, and quietly said the words that would chain her life to his forever. "I'm R.H. Null, I can give him mine." She thought she was simply saving a man. She didn't know she'd just handed the most dangerous person in New York the one secret that made her impossible to replace, and she didn't know that her being there that night wasn't an accident at all. If you've ever believed that one act of courage can change the course of 2 lives, do me a quick favor and tap that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that frozen night in East Harlem, an hour before everything changed, and meet the woman who walked straight into the fire. Halloran's Diner sat tucked away on a corner in East Harlem, and sometime after midnight on February 3rd, it was nearly empty, with only the groan of the old heater and the flicker of blue neon outside the fogged glass door. Maeve Donnelly stood behind the counter, her legs numb after 12 hours straight on her feet, counting the tips in the plastic cup for the 3rd time, as though counting them again might make them grow. $19. 19 loose dollars for an endless night shift, and she knew very well that number was not enough for any of the things waiting to swallow her whole. In the pocket of the coat hanging behind the kitchen was the notice she had read so many times she almost knew it by heart, the cold words printed in bold telling her she had 7 days to pay the overdue rent on her damp basement apartment in East Harlem, or she would be forced to leave. 7 days. And that morning, just before her shift, she had received a call from the nursing home where her father lived. The administrator's voice gentle, but sharp as a knife as he said that if this month's fee was not paid before the weekend, they would have to transfer Tobias to a cheaper facility at the far end of the city, a place Maeve knew would never care properly for a half-paralyzed old man the way she needed them to. She gripped the edge of the counter, drew in a deep breath, and forced the hot tears back behind her eyes, because crying was a luxury she no longer had time for. At the table beside the window, a thin old man in a threadbare coat sat hunched over, his trembling hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago. He came here every night, ordered exactly 1 cup of the cheapest black coffee, and stayed until closing, and Maeve understood perfectly that he did not come for the coffee, but for the warmth, because this place was still warmer than anywhere outside in the skin cutting cold. She glanced toward the kitchen door, where the shift manager was dozing, then quietly refilled the old man's coffee and set a bowl of hot potato soup in front of him, soup she had secretly ladled from the portion she was supposed to eat, murmuring that the kitchen had made too much, and it would be a shame to waste it. The old man looked up at her, his clouded eyes shining with tears, And in that moment, though she herself was swaying at the edge of a cliff, Maeve still felt something inside her soften, because caring for other people was the one thing left intact in her after everything life had taken away, the last remnant of the nurse she had once dreamed of becoming. Before her father's stroke swept that dream down into the dark, she touched the small nightingale pin hidden in the pocket of her apron, the only thing she had kept from her days in lecture halls, and told herself that she only needed to survive this week. Just one more week, and she would find a way. When she turned back to the counter, her gaze accidentally moved toward the table in the darkest corner of the diner, where a strange man had been sitting for nearly 2 hours and whose presence she had almost forgotten. He wore a dark coat far too finely tailored for this neighborhood, his face sunk in shadow beyond the reach of the lights, and all evening he had ordered nothing but a glass of water, simply sitting there, silent, watching her with a gaze she could not read. When she looked up again, the table was empty, the man gone without her noticing, but on the tabletop, tucked beneath the glass, lay a neatly folded $100 bill, an amount so absurd for a glass of water that Maeve stood frozen and stared at it for a long while, her heart pounding without knowing whether it was from relief or from some faint instinct she could not name. She told herself that sometimes people were kind simply because they wanted to be kind, that she had no right to suspect the only rare gift the week had given her. And she slipped the bill into her pocket as though holding on to one small miracle. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, the manager signaled for closing, and Maeve pulled her thin coat around herself, walked the old man to the door, told him to keep warm, then stepped into the freezing night. Snow was still falling thickly, covering the empty streets in white, and she began walking home, both hands pushed deep into her coat pockets, her breath blooming into pale clouds that vanished quickly in the wind. She had only just turned onto the avenue, leading toward the overpass near the river, her head lowered against the wind, her mind still tangled with 7 days, with her father, with $19 and $100, and all the numbers that never seemed to add up to enough, when from somewhere in the distance, tearing through the silence of the snowy night, came the furious roar of an engine, a car racing toward her, with the speed of something fleeing death. Maeve had not yet managed to steady herself, after the explosion threw her face down onto the soaked street, her ears still ringing from the force. Her trembling hands pressed hard against the wound in the shoulder of the strange man lying motionless beside her, when from the slope leading down to the river, 3 sleek black cars came racing in at terrifying speed, their headlights sweeping wildly through the snow. The doors flew open almost all at once, and a group of men in dark clothes poured out, moving fast and cold as shadows trained never to hesitate, several of them gripping things she did not dare look at closely. Maeve instinctively threw herself over the gasping man, stammering that he needed a hospital immediately, that he was losing blood too fast, but her words dissolved into the chaos as a large man dropped to one knee beside them, checked the victim's pulse with frightening expertise, then barked a short command. They lifted the unconscious man, and when Maeve tried to stand and back away, a hand as hard as steel clamped around her arm and pulled her toward the middle car, the man's blunt voice telling her she had to come with them, not as an offer, but as an order she could not refuse. She was shoved into the back seat, pinned between 2 silent men, and the car tore through the night, not toward any public hospital she knew, but through dark streets to a low unmarked building on the edge of the harbor, where a metal door slid open to reveal a bright white corridor, clean and cold as an operating room hidden from the eyes of the world. Inside, an entire team in white coats was already waiting, and they immediately wheeled the wounded man into the inner room, while urgent voices overlapped one another, someone shouting that his blood pressure was dropping, that they needed an emergency transfusion, but his blood type was too rare, and there was no compatible supply in storage. Standing pressed against the wall, her sleeves still stained, her whole body shaking from cold and shock, Maeve heard the words rare blood type, and something inside her, a professional reflex rooted deep in her blood and bones from her years in lecture halls, suddenly rose stronger than fear. She stepped forward, her voice breaking but firm, and said that she had Rh null blood, that she was a universal donor for rare blood types, that she could give him blood right now. For one moment, the entire room froze and stared at her as though looking at something impossible. Then everything happened very quickly. They laid her on the bed beside him. A needle pierced her skin, and she felt her own blood leaving her body, warm and living, flowing through the narrow tube that linked her life to the life of a man whose name she did not even know. She lay there for hours, her eyelids heavy, her mind spinning, exhaustion spreading through her limbs as though she were giving away, not only blood but the last of the strength left in her after all those desperate months, until the heart monitor across the room gradually steadied into an even rhythm, and she knew, through the haze of fatigue, that he had passed the crisis. Maeve drifted off without knowing when, and when she woke in the quiet room, the first thing she realized was that the man in the bed opposite her had opened his eyes, cold gray eyes like metal staring straight at her with a sharp and chilling alertness, lacking any gratitude or gentleness, only the calculating scrutiny of a man who looked at everything through the lens of threat. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask why she was there. The first words that left his pale lips, low and cold, were only, "What did you see?" Maeve answered in confusion that she had only seen the car go down, that she had only tried to save him, but his gaze did not waver, and she understood with a spine-chilling fear that to this man, a witness was not a savior, but a danger to be handled. At that moment, in the corner of the room where he thought she could not hear, one of his men leaned close to his ear and whispered in a troubled voice that they had swept the entire route again, that no one had reported any passerby at that deserted bridge at that hour, that this girl's presence had not been part of any of their calculations, and Cassius Thorne's steel eyes narrowed, slowly turning back toward Maeve with a new question beginning to ignite inside them. Maeve woke for the second time not in the cold white room of the hidden hospital, but in a world so strange that for the first few moments she thought she must still be dreaming. A vast bedroom with soaring ceilings, thick wine-colored velvet curtains, falling over large windows that looked out on a silver-gray bay covered in snow, and beneath her back was a mattress softer than anything she had ever lain on in her life. It took her a long while to remember everything, to remember her blood, to remember the steel eyes of the man in the hospital bed, and when she bolted upright with panic rising in her chest, the door opened softly, and a woman in her 50s stepped inside, her graying hair pinned neatly back, her kind face lined with the wrinkles of an honest, hard-working life, carrying a tray of steaming food in her hands. She introduced herself as Greta, the housekeeper who cared for this mansion, and set the tray beside the bed with a smile so gentle that Maeve almost burst into tears because it had been far too long since anyone had treated her with kindness that did not seem to want anything in return. Greta said this was Mr. Thorne's private residence in Oyster Bay, far from the city, that Maeve had slept for almost an entire day after losing too much blood, and that she had been instructed to help her recover. Maeve pressed her, asking whether she was allowed to go home, because she had a father waiting, a job, 1,000 things collapsing out there. But Greta only squeezed her hand lightly, something like nameless pity flickering in her eyes, then turned the conversation aside and quietly left. When Maeve forced herself to stand, wrapped herself in the robe someone had prepared, and found her way into the hallway, she passed walls hung with expensive oil paintings, marble statues, and thick carpets woven with intricate patterns, all of it displaying a cold and overwhelming wealth that was almost suffocating, a cruel contrast to the mold-damp basement apartment where she had curled up each night. She found him in a large study, seated behind a dark wooden desk, one hand still bandaged, but his posture already straight and commanding, as though only hours earlier he had not been gasping on the edge of death. Cassius Thorne lifted his eyes to her, those gray eyes still sharp as blades, and before she could speak, he said in a low, even voice that she had witnessed things very few people ever witnessed and lived to tell, that she had stepped into a world one could not simply walk out of. Maeve felt anger flare up, overwhelming her fear, and she snapped back that she had seen nothing, that she was only a waitress who happened to pass by and did what any decent human being would have done, that she did not belong here and wanted to go home to her father. He listened without interrupting, and that absolute calm was more frightening than any rage could have been. Then he slowly stood, walked around the desk toward her, and said he was not accustomed to owing anyone, that her saving his life had placed them both in a difficult position, because allowing her to leave now, carrying what she had seen, was a risk he could not accept. Maeve shot back that he had no right to keep her here. that she had a life of her own no matter how miserable it was, and for the first time something almost like amusement passed through the cold edge of his eyes at the sight of a small, exhausted woman, unarmed and barely steady on her feet, daring to stand straight and argue with the man the whole city feared. He stopped one step away from her, looking down at her from his overwhelming height, then said, in a voice so soft, almost only she could hear it, that she still did not understand, that the blood running through her veins was worth far more than she could imagine, worth enough that it had saved her last night, and could also place her in danger in ways she could not yet picture. Maeve went still, a chill running down her spine, and she asked what he meant, what her blood had to do with anything, but he only closed his expression like a steel door, turned his back and walked toward the window, overlooking the bay, leaving the sentence unfinished and letting that confusion hang in the air, then said only that she needed to rest now, that everything else would be discussed when the time came. And Maeve stood there in the middle of that golden, glittering room, like a gilded cage, understanding that the door to freedom had just closed behind her without a sound. 3 days passed inside the Oyster Bay mansion, like 3 days spent inside a dream that was both magnificent and suffocating. And on the morning of the 4th day, while Maeve was sitting beside the large window overlooking the snow-covered bay, trying to swallow the worry for her father clawing through her stomach, Greta came in with a stack of papers and an expression on her kind face that Maeve could not quite read. She set the papers down on the table before her, said softly that Mr. Thorne wanted her to look them over, then quietly withdrew, and when Maeve opened those pages, both her hands began to tremble beyond her control. The entire debt for her father's medical care, the enormous number that had weighed on her shoulders for 2 years and kept her awake through hundreds of nights, had been paid in full, stamped as settled. Her father, Tobias, had not only been spared from transfer to a cheaper facility at the far end of the city, he had been moved to one of the finest nursing homes in Manhattan, a place with private doctors and spacious rooms overlooking the park, every cost prepaid for the entire year. And the last paper, the one that made her throat close, was a receipt showing that the entire overdue rent on her basement apartment had been cleared, the lease extended indefinitely in her name without costing her a cent. For one brief moment, a dizzying relief poured through Maeve so powerfully that she had to grip the edge of the table, tears springing to her eyes, because for the first time in years, the burden she had thought would crush her had suddenly been lifted from her shoulders. But right after that relief, something else rose, cold and sharp, an understanding that made her shiver, because she realized no favor in this man's world was ever given freely, that each of these papers was not a gift but a link in a chain, and he was using the very things she loved most to forge the chain that would bind her to him. She folded the papers, stood, and went to find him, her heart burning with an emotion tangled between gratitude and fury, and she found Cassius in the familiar study, standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. She set the papers down hard on his desk, her voice trembling but unyielding, and asked him what all of this meant. He turned back, calmly took a sip of coffee, then answered that he was simply repaying a debt, that she had given him her blood, so he had returned peace to her, a fair exchange between two adults. Maeve shook her head, and the words she had held back for days burst out, that she knew exactly what he was doing, that he was not repaying a debt but buying her outright, using her father and her home as leverage so she would never dare leave, so he could turn her gratitude into a soft set of shackles. She looked straight into those cold gray eyes and said with all the dignity still left inside her exhausted soul that he could not buy her, that she had not run into the fire that night because he was a powerful kingpin, or because she hoped to be rewarded, but because he was a human being dying right in front of her, nothing more and nothing less. And if he thought he could turn that into a debt to be paid, then he had never truly understood who she was. For a moment, the room fell into absolute silence, and for the first time since meeting her, something flickered through Cassius's steel eyes, not anger, but a rare surprise, almost confusion, as though he had just collided with something all his wealth and power could not possibly price. He set the coffee cup down, looked at her for a long while with an unreadable gaze, then said in a low, rough voice that in his world, everything had a price. Every person he had ever met could be bought one way or another, and that she was the first exception he had met in years that made him uncertain where to place her. Maeve did not step back. answering that perhaps the problem was not how much she was worth, but that he had grown so used to seeing people as merchandise that he had forgotten some things in this life were never meant to be for sale, and she left those words hanging between them before turning and walking out of the study, leaving the most powerful man in New York standing still as he watched her disappear behind the door, for the first time in many years not knowing what to say. That night, when the entire mansion had sunk into silence and snow was still quietly covering the bay outside, Maeve could not sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the conversation in the study, and when she felt her way downstairs to the kitchen for a cup of warm water, she heard a faint sound drifting from the end of the upper hallway, a low broken groan, the kind of sound her professional instincts immediately recognized as belonging to someone in pain. She hesitated for a moment, knowing very well that following it might be a mistake, but her feet had already carried her toward the half-open door at the end of the hall, and through the narrow gap she saw Cassius Thorne, the powerful and cold man feared by the entire city, sitting hunched on the edge of the bed in the darkness, one hand gripping his injured shoulder, sweat standing on his forehead though the room was cold, his breathing heavy and uneven. She realized at once that the old wound was tormenting him, that the bandage had probably shifted, and the pain was coming in waves, and before she could weigh the consequences, the nurse's instinct in her pushed her into the room. Cassius snapped his head up, his steel eyes flashing with the wariness of an animal caught at its weakest, and he told her through clenched teeth to get out, but Maeve did not step back. She only said calmly that his wound was reopening, that if he left it that way, he would run a high fever and all the effort of saving him that night would have been wasted. Perhaps it was that fearless calm, or perhaps the pain had drained the resistance from him. But Cassius fell silent, and Maeve took that silence as permission. She found the medical kit in the bathroom, washed her hands carefully, then returned to his side, gently peeling the soaked bandage away from his shoulder, with the practiced and decisive movements of someone who had done this hundreds of times during her years of training. She cleaned the wound and dressed it again, her hands touching his skin with care and professionalism, without trembling, without hesitation, only with the absolute focus of a woman doing the thing her whole life had once trained her to do. During all of it, neither of them said a word, but the silence between them was no longer the hostile silence of before. It was something different, almost fragile, as though both of them understood that in this dark room, in this moment, they were no longer kingpin and captive, but only one person in pain and another person easing that pain. When she had finished the bandage and placed 2 pain pills and a glass of water in his hand, forcing him to drink with the gentle sternness she had once used with patience, Cassius looked at her for a long while, his gaze no longer as sharp as before, but carrying something she could not name. Then he quietly asked why she was doing this for a man who had kept her here, a man she should hate. Maeve straightened and answered simply that she was not caring for him because of who he was or because of what he had done to her, but because in front of her right now was a human being in pain, and she did not know how to look away from that. It was her nature, the one thing life had not yet managed to take from her. He did not answer, only leaned back against the pillows as the medicine began to take hold, and his breathing slowly evened out, and Maeve gathered the medical kit to leave. It was then, as she reached to switch off the small lamp on the bedside table, that her eyes accidentally stopped on a silver picture frame tilted in a shadowed corner, almost hidden behind a stack of books. Inside the frame was the face of a young woman smiling, a smile so bright and strangely warm, her eyes shining with the happiness of someone who had been loved, and Maeve froze as she looked at that photograph, feeling something heavy and sorrowful radiating from it, an untold story hidden beneath the thin layer of dust on the glass. She glanced at the man drifting into sleep on the bed, the cold man who seemed to have no heart left, then looked back at the radiant face in the frame, and for the first time, she wondered what had turned a human being into such a statue of ice, and where the woman in that photograph was now. The next morning, the image of the woman in the silver frame still haunted Maeve's mind when she went down to the kitchen to help Greta prepare breakfast, a small habit she had created for herself during the days she had been kept here because she could not bear the feeling of sitting idle like a prisoner waiting. As she helped the older woman sort vegetables beside the large wooden table in the warm kitchen, Maeve hesitantly told her about the night before, about how she had changed Mr. Thorne's bandage and accidentally seen the photograph of the young woman hidden behind the stack of books. And she asked Greta carefully who the woman in the picture was. Greta's hands went still, her eyes growing faintly sad as she looked out through the snow-covered window, silent for a long while as though weighing whether she should speak. Then she sighed and began, her voice lowering with compassion. She said she had worked for this family for nearly 20 years, had watched Cassius grow from a young man into the man he was now, and that very few people knew what he had lived through. She said he had been orphaned when he was very young, had grown up in the harshest poor neighborhoods of the city, where a child with no mother and no father had to learn how to survive hunger, cold, and violence, had to harden himself just to get through each day. She said that if not for an old priest named Brennan at St. Cecilia's Church, the man who had taken him in, given him shelter, and taught him that there were still decent things in this world, then the boy Cassius had been might never have lived long enough to become a man, and Father Brennan, even now, remained the only person on earth Cassius still respected. Maeve listened, a sorrow she could not quite name rising inside her as she pictured that lonely child, and then she softly asked about the woman in the photograph. Greta fell quiet, her eyes glistening, and then she said that was her, the only woman who had ever softened Cassius's hardened heart, his fiancée, the woman he had loved with everything still left inside him. She said he had been entirely different back then, that he had known how to laugh, that he had begun speaking about another future, a life away from the darkness, and that this whole mansion had once been filled with the sound of that woman's laughter. But then, 6 years earlier, in a plot meant for Cassius himself, someone struck, and she, the innocent woman who had never touched his world, died before his eyes, in his arms, on the fateful night when he could not protect the person he loved. Greta quickly wiped the corner of her eye and said that from that night on, the man who had once known how to smile died in part, that he locked himself behind a shell of ice no one could reach, that he believed with every hidden corner of his soul that loving someone meant giving his enemies a weakness they could use to kill them, and so he swore he would never let his heart soften again. She said he became more ruthless, colder, more distant, as though every cruel act were another brick he built into the wall between himself and pain, and the name The Undertaker, which people whispered when they spoke of him, was born from those dark years. Maeve sat in silence for a long time after Greta finished, her hands clasped tightly together, and something in the way she saw this man quietly shifted. She did not forget that he was dangerous, that his hands had done things she did not dare imagine. But now, through Greta's story, she began to see something else hidden behind that shell of steel. Not a monster born that way, but an orphaned child once abandoned in the cold. A man who had once dared to love and had been crushed so completely by grief that he chose to turn himself to stone so he would never have to be hurt again. And as she lifted her eyes toward the silver-gray bay beyond the window, Maeve suddenly understood that behind the most feared man in New York was a wound so deep it had never healed, and for reasons she could not explain, that thought made her heart ache and stirred a compassion she knew was dangerous for herself. A few days later, when Cassius's wound had improved and he needed to go out to handle a matter Maeve was not allowed to ask about, he unexpectedly told her to come with him. Perhaps because he did not want to leave her alone in the mansion, perhaps for some other reason he did not say, and the car carried them through the snow-covered city to an old church tucked quietly among the older streets, St. Cecilia's, with its faded stained-glass windows and stone steps worn smooth by the footsteps of generations. Inside, beneath the flicker of candlelight and the faint scent of incense, an old priest with snow-white hair was quietly straightening hymnals, and when he looked up and saw Cassius enter, his wrinkled face softened into a smile both glad and worried, the smile of a father seeing a lost son return. This was Father Brennan, and Maeve understood at once that between that cold and powerful man and this old priest there was an unusual bond, because the way Cassius bowed his head to greet him carried a respect she had never seen him give anyone else. While Cassius exchanged a few quiet words with another man in the corner of the church, Father Brennan came closer to Maeve, his kind eyes studying her with warm curiosity, and he asked who she was, because it had been a very long time since he had seen Cassius bring a stranger to this place. Maeve answered politely that her name was Maeve Donnelly, and the instant the Donnelly name left her mouth, She clearly saw something pass across the old priest's face, a pause so brief it could almost have been missed, his eyes blinking quickly, and the hand holding the hymnal tightening slightly, as though that name had touched something buried deep in his memory. But in the next instant, the expression was gone, neatly hidden behind his gentle smile, and Father Brennan only said softly that it was a beautiful name, then quickly moved on to ask where she came from, leaving Maeve to wonder whether she had only imagined that strange reaction. When Cassius returned, Father Brennan invited them both to sit on one of the long wooden pews, and with a frankness that stunned Maeve, the old priest began speaking to the kingpin, in words she was certain no one else on earth would dare say to him. He said he had heard about the incident beneath the bridge, that he knew Cassius's war in the shadows had flared again, and he asked him directly when he would finally stop, when he would finally understand that every life he took, every sin he piled upon himself, was only digging the pit deeper into which he was burying himself. Cassius sat still, his jaw clenched, his steel eyes fixed on the altar, and Father Brennan's voice softened as he continued, saying he still remembered the boy from long ago, the child trembling from hunger and cold whom he had once taken in, and that deep inside him, that child was still there, that a soul still existed inside him that could be redeemed if he would only open his heart, that atonement was never too late as long as the heart was still beating. Maeve sat beside them, listening quietly, and she saw one muscle in Cassius's face twitch, a tiny sign that those words had touched some place inside him that no threat and no power could ever reach. On the way back, sitting beside him, as the car rolled through streets washed in yellow light, Maeve could not hold back and said softly that Father Brennan was right, that no one was born a monster, and no one had to remain a monster forever, that he still had a chance to choose another path. Cassius did not answer, only looked out through the window, but she realized he had not dismissed her words as sharply as he usually did, and inside that silence, some fragile seed had just been planted, though neither of them yet understood it, and deep in Maeve's heart, the strange reaction of the old priest when he heard her surname still lingered, an unanswered question, in the days that followed, as Maeve slowly grew used to the rhythm of life inside the mansion and was no longer kept under such strict watch as before. She began to notice the people who quietly existed in the hidden corners of this enormous house. People she realized Cassius and the entire machinery around him had almost never truly seen. They were the bodyguards who stood watch for hours in the cold, the maids who cleaned silently from the first gray light of morning, the drivers who waited all night beside running cars, all of them treated like part of the furniture, like useful tools without names or histories. But Maeve was different. The nature of a woman, who had spent years serving others, made it impossible for her to look at people through that lens, and she began doing small things that seemed natural to her, but were so unfamiliar in this house that they left people stunned. She brewed hot coffee and carried it out to the guard, shivering by the gate in the snowy night. She asked the cleaning woman her name, and remembered that she had a sick daughter. She stayed to talk with the cook about the food of his hometown, instead of simply taking her plate and leaving. Among those people was a young bodyguard named Eddie, a man of about 23, with a face still too young beneath the awkward hardness he tried to wear, who always stood guard in the hallway near her room. At first he kept the cold distance he had been trained to maintain, but Maeve's steady and genuine kindness slowly melted that shell, and one evening, when she brought him a bowl of hot soup and asked how he was, Eddie opened up and told her that he had taken this job because he needed money for his single mother's medical treatment, that he had never wanted to be tied to this violent world, but had no other choice, that it had been a very long time since anyone in this house had asked him something as simple as whether he was all right. Maeve listened with all the compassion she had, told him there was no shame in carrying his family, that she understood what it felt like to be pushed into a corner by life, and Eddie looked at her with the gratitude of a young man being seen as a human being for the first time, instead of a shadow holding a gun. What Maeve did not know was that from the upper balcony, Cassius had been quietly watching all of this for days, and a strange confusion kept growing inside the man who had believed he understood human nature completely. He saw his iron-faced guards begin to nod gently in greeting when she passed, saw the old cook smile more often, saw the cold atmosphere of the house itself seem to warm under the presence of a girl who possessed nothing but kindness. He could not understand how a powerless woman, a woman he was keeping here against her will, could make the hardened people around him change through gestures so simple, while all his fortune and power had only ever purchased obedience and had never once bought the human heart. One night, when Maeve passed by the study, Cassius called her in, and in a low voice that was difficult to read, he asked why she bothered with people he paid to serve, people who were only tools in his eyes. Maeve looked straight at him and answered that no one in this world was a tool, that every person she met carried a story, a pain, a family waiting for them to come home, and that perhaps the people he called tools were actually the only people who would stand by him with honest loyalty when everything collapsed. If only he would look at them as human beings. Cassius watched her in silence for a long time under the yellow light of the study, and this time, in those steel eyes, there was no longer guarded scrutiny, but something softer, warmer, something even he did not yet dare to name. And between the two people standing across from each other in that quiet room, an invisible thread had just begun to tremble. Fragile but real. Late one night, unable to sleep because the image of Cassius's gaze in the study kept returning to her mind, Maeve decided to go down to the kitchen and make herself a cup of warm tea, choosing the quieter side corridor so she would not wake anyone. It was as she passed the old library in the east wing of the mansion that she heard voices drifting from behind the half-closed door, and some instinct made her stop and press herself into the shadow of the wall. She recognized the voice at once. It was Silas Ward, the man in his 40s who always stood close beside Cassius like a shadow, the longtime right hand trusted by the entire family, the man Maeve had seen the Kingpin consult during closed meetings. But Silas's voice was entirely different now, no longer carrying its usual respect, but edged with a calculating coldness that chilled her as he spoke over the phone to someone on the other end of the line. Maeve held her breath, her heart pounding, and every word that reached her ears felt like a shard of ice. He said the plan beneath the bridge should have been perfect, that the bomb planted in the Escalade should have ended everything cleanly, that once Cassius was erased, transferring control of the entire harbor system to the Vanderlyn family would go smoothly, exactly as agreed, and that the enormous payment and the position of the new boss would belong to him. Maeve gripped the teacup in her hands so tightly, she nearly shattered it as the truth lay bare before her. That the explosion that night had not been an accident, that the most trusted man of all had betrayed his master and arranged his death, quietly selling the entire empire to the enemy. But what made the blood in her body seem to freeze was what Silas said next, when he hissed in irritation that everything had nearly fallen apart because of one stupid variable, some nameless little waitress who had appeared from nowhere. He said that according to the original calculation, a random witness was supposed to appear at the scene, some insignificant nobody he could later blame for everything, building a story about a robbery or a madman's attack before quietly eliminating that person to seal off the loose end, a disposable pawn placed deliberately in his game. But he had never expected that girl, instead of panicking and running away or standing frozen like an obedient witness, to rush straight into the fire and drag Cassius out of the car 3 seconds before it exploded, then give him her own rare blood to keep him alive, overturning the entire carefully arranged plan and turning a perfect assassination into a humiliating failure. Maeve stood rooted in the darkness, her whole body cold as she realized that her presence that night had not been a stroke of random luck at all, that she had been placed there by an invisible hand to become a sacrificial pawn in a plot she had not even known existed, and that the woman who had saved Cassius, the woman the Kingpin now wanted to keep, was the very person Silas most desperately wanted to erase in order to bury every trace. Just as she stood frozen in that chaos of thought, the teacup trembled in her hand, and the metal spoon lightly struck the rim, making the tiniest clink, but in the stillness of the late night it sounded painfully clear, and Silas's voice stopped at once. Maeve heard his footsteps moving quickly toward the door, and in that terrifying instant, she pressed herself deeper into the dark alcove behind the large stone statue at the corner of the corridor, holding her breath until it almost hurt, her heart pounding so wildly she thought he might hear it. The library door swung open, and Silas stepped out, his sharp eyes sweeping across the dark hallway, lingering for a long time on the very corner where she was hiding, and Maeve felt that gaze pass over her like a cold blade, each second stretching as long as a century. until at last he frowned slightly, muttered something under his breath, and turned back inside, leaving her standing there in the darkness, trembling with a terrible secret that could save Cassius and could also get her killed. For the rest of that night, Maeve could not sleep. She lay wide awake, staring up at the dark ceiling, her mind spinning inside a struggle with no clear way out, because she knew she was holding a truth that could save Cassius's life, but could also send her straight to her death. She wondered whether she should tell him, and every time she resolved to confess everything, a cold fear crashed through her, because Silas Ward was the right hand who had stood beside Cassius for so many years, the man he trusted absolutely, while she was only a nameless waitress who had been kept here for less than 2 weeks. And if she spoke up to accuse such a trusted man without any proof in her hands, he might think she was lying, that she was trying to sow division in order to find a way out. And then not only would she lose the fragile trust that had only just begun to form, but she might also drive Silas to move against her sooner. But then the image of Cassius gasping on the edge of death that night, and the strangely warm look in his eyes in the dark study the evening before, made it impossible for her to stay silent and let him walk into a deadly trap. By morning, after a sleepless night, Maeve chose caution. She would not accuse Silas outright, but would warn Cassius indirectly, plant a seed of suspicion in him, and let him trace the truth himself. She found Cassius in the study, and in a voice she tried to keep calm. She said she had an uneasy feeling, that she believed whoever was behind the attack that night was not some distant outside force, but someone very close to him. Someone who knew his movements, and even the most hidden layers of his protection, because no outsider could have arranged a strike so precise without someone on the inside pointing the way. At first, Cassius frowned, the familiar guarded look flickering through his eyes, and he asked coldly what right she had to say something so serious, whether she was trying to spread suspicion in order to win her freedom. Maeve did not waver. She only answered calmly that she had nothing to gain by lying, that she only wanted him alive, and she repeated one detail she had heard in the night, that the fatal car had been compromised with an explosive device beforehand, not attacked randomly on the road, that the mastermind had known exactly which car he would take and which route he would follow. The moment he heard that, Maeve saw Cassius's expression change, his steel eyes narrowing as a terrifying stillness settled over him, because the detail she had just given him matched with chilling precision a vague suspicion he himself had quietly carried but had not dared face, the uneasy sense that only a very small number of people had known the schedule that night, and Silas was among them. For the first time since meeting her, Cassius did not dismiss her words, did not treat them as the nonsense of a captive. Instead, he sat in silence for a very long while, his fingers tapping slowly against the dark wooden desk, his gaze distant as though he were turning over every face, every meeting, every small sign he had once overlooked. At last he raised his eyes to hers, and in a low, rough voice, he said he would remember what she had told him, that if there truly was a traitor among his inner circle, then that man had made a fatal mistake by letting her survive that night. But instead of immediately exploding in rage, or ordering Silas seized as Maeve had secretly feared, Cassius did something that surprised her. He told her she must not reveal a single thing, that she had to keep behaving normally as though she knew nothing, because the only way to set a trap for an old fox was to let him believe he was still safe, still holding the advantage. And in the look he gave her then, Maeve recognized something new. It was no longer the gaze of a captor looking at a hostage, but the gaze of a man who had just decided, for the first time in many years, to place a piece of his trust in someone else's hands, and she understood that from this moment on, their fates were bound together more tightly than ever. From the day Maeve planted the suspicion of a traitor in Cassius's mind, something between them quietly changed. The wall of ice he had spent years building began to crack little by little, and they started giving each other moments that both of them silently understood no longer belonged to the relationship between captor and captive. Late one night, when the entire mansion had grown quiet, Maeve found him sitting alone in the dark study, a glass of untouched liquor beside him, his eyes fixed on the fire in the hearth, and she quietly stepped inside and sat in the chair across from him. In the flickering firelight, Cassius began to speak for the first time, slowly and hesitantly, like a man who had gone too long, without allowing himself to say the things he had buried. He told her about the orphaned child he had once been, about nights of hunger and cold, about the way the world had taught him that weakness meant death. And then his voice faltered when it reached the woman in the photograph, the fiancée he had not been able to protect. Maeve listened with her whole heart, and when he spoke of the moment he lost her, she saw the strong hands of that powerful man tremble slightly, a naked pain passing across a face that was usually cold as stone. In that fragile moment, their eyes met, and a wordless pull drew them closer, close enough that Maeve could hear his breathing, close enough that the boundary between them seemed about to dissolve. But at that very instant, Cassius abruptly stood, turned his back to her, and his voice grew hard and distant as he said she should go back to her room and rest, that things like this should not happen. Maeve understood at once what was happening, and instead of quietly withdrawing, she stood and stepped closer, telling him plainly that she knew he was afraid, that he was pushing her away because he believed loving someone would only bring that person death, just as it had before. But she asked how long he would keep imprisoning himself inside a prison built by his own fear. Cassius turned sharply, his steel eyes blazing with violent conflict, and after a heavy moment of silence, he admitted in a rough voice that yes, he was afraid, that from the day she entered his life for the first time in 6 years, he had felt something waking inside a chest he had thought had turned to stone, and that frightened him more than any enemy, because he could not bear losing another person, because of his own existence. That confession hung between them like a taut thread of silk, and then Cassius drew a deep breath, his gaze darkening as he said there was something he had to tell her, a truth he had kept hidden. He told her that after the night she gave him blood to save his life, information about her extraordinarily rare Rh-null blood had leaked outside, and he was certain Silas, the traitor hidden inside his ranks, had quietly passed that information to the Vanderlyn family. He said the leader of the Vanderlyn family was now gravely ill, his life measured only in days, and the cruel irony was that the man also carried an extremely rare blood type that only universal rare blood like hers could save, which meant that in the eyes of the enemy, Maeve was no longer merely a witness who needed to be silenced. Cassius looked straight into her eyes, his voice lowering with worry, as he said their plan had changed completely, that they no longer wanted to kill her, but to take her alive at any cost, to exploit her blood like a resource, to turn her into a priceless captive commodity, and that this made her a double target, hunted by political conspiracy, and hunted for the very life flowing through her veins. Maeve went still as every piece of the nightmare fell into place, understanding that she had been pulled into a whirlpool deeper and darker than she had ever imagined, and just as she opened her mouth to say something, the entire mansion suddenly plunged into darkness as the power was cut, and a heartbeat later the security alarm screamed through the night, announcing that the enemy had not given them even one more second to prepare. Darkness swallowed the entire mansion in an instant, and the security alarm screamed like a sentence being passed as the frantic sounds from beyond the gate announced that a group of men was storming in, flashlight beams slashing across the great windows. Cassius reacted with the speed of a man who had lived his entire life in danger, pulling Maeve behind him, his voice urgent, yet still cold with authority, as he ordered her to stay close and not leave his side by even half a step. She understood at once that this was the attack they had just spoken of, that Silas had moved before they could set their trap, bringing Vanderlyn's men into the house to take her alive and finish the kingpin in the same night. Throughout the enormous building came the sound of running feet, shattering glass, and chaotic shouts as Cassius's loyal guards hurled themselves against the men breaking in, and in the flickering darkness lit only by blood-red emergency lights, everything became a maze of struggling shadows. Cassius moved through the corridors with astonishing mastery, every step calculated, bringing down anyone who blocked their path with sharp and efficient blows, never theatrical, only focused on opening a safe way out for Maeve, one hand always gripping her tightly, as though he would rather die than let her slip beyond his reach. In the middle of that chaos, the young guard Eddie suddenly appeared from a side passage, his youthful face tense, but his eyes resolute, saying he would cover the rear so the boss could get the girl out. They had barely crossed the grand hall when a group of Vanderlyn men blocked the exit, and in the life-or-death instant, when one of them lunged toward Maeve, Eddie threw himself across her path without hesitation, shoving her aside to save her from the blow, and in the sharp crack that rang through the hall, The young man fell onto the cold stone floor. Maeve cried out in horror, her professional instincts sending her to her knees beside him, both hands pressing hard against the wound spreading across his chest, her mouth trembling as she begged him to hold on. But Eddie only looked at her with fading eyes, smiled faintly, and said she was the first person in this house who had ever treated him like a human being. Then his hand went limp in hers, tears streaming down her face. Maeve had no time to fully break before another cry reached her, this time Greta's voice, the old housekeeper, trying to help a maid escape, when a blast of shrapnel from an explosion struck her and sent her collapsing near the foot of the stairs, a deep wound in her thigh leaving her unable to stand. Maeve pushed aside the grief that had just torn through her, rushed to Greta's side, and in that moment the nurse inside her rose more powerfully than fear, her hands immediately working with trained calm. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her own dress, tied it tightly above the wound to slow the bleeding, pressed the heel of her palm against the right arterial point to hold back the flow, and kept reassuring the older woman in a voice both gentle and steady that she would be all right, that Maeve was here now. Cassius had just brought down the last man, blocking the way when he turned and caught sight of her. Maeve kneeling in the chaos of darkness and explosions, both hands covered in someone else's blood, pouring every ounce of herself into pulling one life back from death. And in that brief moment, on a night when everything around him was destruction and betrayal, he saw in this small woman a light he had never seen in all his life, a courage and a compassion that did not retreat even with death closing in around her. He rushed forward, one arm lifting Greta, and handing her to one of the remaining trusted guards to take for emergency treatment, the other pulling Maeve to her feet, and when their eyes met in the blood-red glow of that terrible night, not a single word was spoken, yet both of them understood that something had changed forever, that this girl had become the one thing he could not lose, and that the real war had only just begun. When the trusted guard had gotten Greta away, and the gunfire began to thin, signaling that Vanderlyn's men were being pushed back, Cassius pulled Maeve toward the rear exit of the mansion, a small hope beginning to kindle inside him, that they were about to escape this nightmare, when a figure stepped out from the darkness of the hallway leading to the garden and blocked their path. It was Silas Ward, and this time he was no longer hiding his true face behind a mask of loyalty, his expression cold and triumphant beneath the blood-red emergency lights. Before Cassius could react, Silas lunged forward with the speed of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment, and in an instant he wrapped an arm tightly around Maeve, dragging her hard against him as a shield, a sharp, cold knife pressed against her throat. Cassius stopped dead, his whole body seeming to turn to stone, his steel eyes widening at the sight of the trusted man who had betrayed him holding the woman he had just admitted was the only thing that had brought his hardened heart back to life. Silas sneered, his voice ringing out with malice as he declared that this was the most valuable prize of the entire night, that the blood running through this girl's body was worth a fortune, that he would take her away and Cassius could do nothing but stand there and watch, because if he moved even one step, the blade would not be merciful. Cassius stood rooted in place, both fists clenched until his knuckles whitened, and for the first time in his life, the man who was always in control was utterly powerless, because he knew one wrong movement could steal Maeve's life right before his eyes, exactly as he had once been helpless to watch the woman he loved die 6 years before. But in that suffocating moment, Maeve was not a trembling hostage waiting to be saved, because during her years of nursing training, she had learned the structure of the human body by heart, knew every weakness, every nerve, every place where the right strike could make even a large man collapse. In a flash, she remembered something she had once overheard in the mansion, that Silas carried an old knee injury from many years ago, a weakness he always tried to hide, though the faint limp in his walk had betrayed him. She drew a breath so quiet it barely moved her chest, forced herself to stay calm on the edge of life and death, then suddenly drove her full body weight down, stomping her heel hard into the back of his injured knee while slamming her elbow into the vulnerable point beneath his ribs, knocking the breath from him. Silas let out a cry of pain, his leg buckled, and the arm locked around her loosened for a single instant, the blade slipping away from her throat, and that was the instant Maeve needed. She tore herself free and rolled forward, out of his reach. The moment she escaped was the only moment Cassius needed, and he surged forward with all the speed and strength compressed inside his fury, stripping the knife from Silas's hand with one decisive blow and driving him face first onto the stone floor, pinning the traitor beneath the weight of his body. The rage in Cassius then was something primal and terrifying, his hand tightening around Silas's collar, his steel eyes burning with the desire to end the man who had dared put a blade to the throat of the woman who was his, and for one moment it seemed certain he would kill him there. But even in that fury, the cold reason of a seasoned kingpin held him back, because he did not yet know the full truth behind everything, did not know what secret Silas still held, who he had colluded with inside the Vanderlyn family, or how far this web of betrayal had spread, and a living traitor was still a traitor who could reveal it all. He shoved Silas's face hard against the stone floor, his low voice cutting like ice, as he said the man would not be allowed to die so easily, that he would name, every plot, every filthy dollar, then ordered his men to bind him tightly and take him away. When everything settled, Cassius turned to Maeve, who was still gasping beside him, and he looked at her with eyes holding countless things he did not put into words: shock, gratitude, and a deep respect for the woman who had just escaped death's claws on her own and opened a path for him. Not a weak victim waiting to be rescued, but a strong and courageous human being who had stood beside him on the line between life and death. Silas was escorted down to a sealed room beneath the mansion, bound tightly to an iron chair, and while Cassius's men searched through all his possessions and devices, they found an encrypted phone and a stack of hidden files he had kept carefully tucked away like insurance for his own survival. When Cassius entered the room, his steel eyes were colder than ever. He set the files on the table and began questioning him about every plot, every name inside the Vanderlyn family. And Silas, knowing he had reached the end of the road, tried at first to remain stubborn, but little by little, with the venomous attitude of a man who had nothing left to lose, he began to talk. He admitted he had been quietly selling out the empire for years, had colluded with the enemy while waiting for the chance to seize power. But when Cassius pressed him to the very end, a twisted smile appeared on his face, and the next words out of his mouth were like a knife driven straight into the deepest place inside Cassius. Silas said his plot had not begun with the explosion beneath the bridge, that it had been planted long before, on the very fateful night 6 years earlier, the night the woman Cassius loved had died. He sneered and said that for 6 years Cassius had frantically hunted and punished the people he believed were responsible, had waged war against countless families, had stained his hands with more acts of vengeance than anyone could count. But all of it had been meaningless, because he had never avenged her against the right man. Silas lowered his voice, every word thick with poisonous satisfaction, confessing that he was the one who had orchestrated the entire assassination all those years ago, that he had arranged everything so Cassius's fiancée would die, not because he bore her any personal hatred, but because he knew only her death would be strong enough to shatter Cassius, to turn him from a man, slowly beginning to leave the darkness, into a cold and solitary monster, easy to manipulate, so that step by step Silas could rise to power and secure a place of absolute trust at his side. He said that for 6 years he had stood right beside Cassius, pretending to share his grief, pretending to help him hunt his enemies, while in truth he had been the one pulling every string, and that the pain that had reshaped him had in fact been a product made by Silas's own hands. The room sank into a terrible silence as the truth came out, and Maeve, standing near the door and witnessing it all, saw Cassius's whole body seem to be struck by lightning, his face going pale, his steel eyes breaking into something so filled with pain and rage that it was almost unbearable. 6 years of torment, 6 years of locking himself inside grief, 6 years of believing he had failed to protect the woman he loved. All of it now stood revealed as a cruel performance directed by the very man he had trusted most. A strangled growl rose in Cassius's throat, and he lunged at Silas with all the fury of a man who had just learned that his entire life had been shaped by a lying hand, his fingers closing around the traitor's throat, trembling with the desire to end him at once in vengeance for the dead, his eyes emptied of reason and filled only with a sea of hatred. But in that very instant Maeve rushed forward, both hands pressing against his shaking arms, her voice rising through the storm, urgent and gentle, begging him to stop. She said she understood his pain, that she knew Silas deserved the worst, but if he acted now, If he let hatred control him, then Silas would win all over again, because he would turn Cassius into the very monster he had worked so hard to create. And then Cassius would lose himself, lose the man the woman from all those years ago had once loved. She said death was too easy for a man like Silas, that true justice was not in choking him in rage, but in forcing him to face the consequences of everything he had done. For one long moment that seemed endless, the entire room held its breath, and then, little by little, beneath the warmth of Maeve's hands and the weight of her words, Cassius's clenched fingers slowly loosened, his ragged breathing began to steady, and he stepped back, his whole body trembling but his control restored, choosing for the first time in his life not to let rage decide his actions. And he knew that this woman, once again, had pulled him back from the edge. After Silas was taken away, and the storm inside the basement room finally quieted, Cassius ordered his men to comb through every file the traitor had kept hidden, tracing every lead connected to the Vanderlyn network. And it was while turning through those old documents that Maeve, standing beside him and helping sort the papers, accidentally saw a name that made her heart seem to stop. In a yellowed file recording old harbor takeover deals from many years before, among a long list of people crushed beneath the Thorn Empire as it expanded, there was a name she could never mistake. It was her father's name, Tobias Donnelly. Maeve's hands trembled as she read each cold, emotionless line, and piece by piece, the dark past she had never fully understood began to take shape before her eyes. The file stated that her father had once been an honest dock worker, one of the men who had stood up in protest when Thorne's organization used every method possible to seize control of the harbor, forcing laborers into unemployment. And because of that resistance, he had been retaliated against, blacklisted, stripped of his job, and robbed of any chance of finding decent work anywhere else in the city. Maeve kept reading, tears blurring the lines, understanding that this chain of events had been the beginning of every tragedy in her life, that her father had slipped from being a man with steady work into poverty, that years of mounting burden and pressure had worn down his health until the stroke struck him down, and that the enormous medical bills had swept away everything the two of them had, pushing her into abandoning her nursing dream and trudging through the snow to work late-night shifts as a waitress. She stood frozen, and a terrible truth crashed into her mind like a cold wave, that the man she had risked her life to save, the man toward whom her heart had slowly begun to lean, was the very symbol of the empire that had indirectly destroyed her father's life and driven her whole family into the abyss. Cassius noticed the sudden change on her face, and when he looked at the file in her hand and read the name Tobias Donnelly, he too went still, because now he understood why Father Brennan had paused when he heard that surname in the church the other day. The old priest must have known for a long time about the fateful connection between these two people, but had chosen to remain silent. Maeve lifted her eyes to him, red with pain and fury, her voice breaking as she asked whether this was true, whether his empire had turned her father into a number on a list of people ground down beneath it, and how many other families had been shattered like hers in order to build the cold wealth inside this mansion. Cassius could not deny it, and for the first time in his life, he faced directly the human cost his empire had caused, not through numbers in ledgers or abstract deals, but through the tear-soaked face of the woman who had saved his life, the woman who carried inside her an entire story of suffering, written by the hands of his own organization. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat because he knew no justification could erase that truth, that for years he had lived in a world where people were only pieces on a board, obstacles to be removed, and he had never once thought about the lives buried under each step he took. Maeve stepped back, both hands clutching her chest as though trying to keep her heart from breaking apart, and through her tears she said she did not know how to face this, that she did not know how she could have feelings for the man who represented everything that had stolen her childhood and her future. And then she fled from the room, leaving Cassius standing alone among the dust-covered files, for the first time in his life overwhelmed, not by enemies or gun barrels, but by the terrible weight of an awakened conscience, forced to face the truth of himself and all the ruin he had scattered through the world. The next morning, Maeve packed the few things she owned into her old cloth bag, her heart heavy with a decision she knew was right and yet strangely painful. She would leave this mansion, leave the man whose presence now meant an entire tragic past she could not bear to face. But before she went, there was one place she needed to go, and she asked to be taken to St. Cecilia's church, where Father Brennan was quietly lighting the morning candles. When the old priest looked up and saw her enter, with tear tracks still marked across her face, he seemed to understand at once what had brought her here, and he sighed softly, setting the candle down. Maeve stepped toward him, her voice trembling, as she asked him directly whether he had known, whether from the moment he heard her Donnelly surname, he had understood the connection between her father and the Thorne Empire, and why he had stayed silent. Father Brennan did not look away, his kind eyes brimming with tears as he admitted that yes, he had known, that he had remembered the name Tobias Donnelly from many years before, one of the honest men he had watched being pulled into the cruel machinery of the underworld. He said that for all these years he had carried the weight of secrets like that, had witnessed more tragedies than he could count, and been powerless to stop them, and that he had prayed every day for the soul of Cassius, the orphan child he loved like a son, the child he still believed had, deep at the very bottom of him, a spark of light that might yet be redeemed. He told Maeve that when she appeared, when he saw the way Cassius changed beside her, he believed perhaps she was the answer to those prayers, the one fate had brought to save the soul sinking in his darkness, and because of that belief he had chosen silence, a silence he now knew had been unfair to her. Then the old priest took her hands and said with deep understanding that he had no right to ask her for forgiveness, that forgiveness was never an obligation anyone could impose on the one who had been hurt, that it was a choice, the hardest and noblest choice a human being could make, and that whether she chose to stay or leave, whether she chose to forgive or not, no one had the right to judge her. Those words were like a medicine that both soothed and cut deeper into Maeve's heart, and she stepped out of the church with her heart even more tangled than when she had arrived. When she returned to the mansion to gather the last of her belongings before leaving, Cassius was waiting for her in the grand hall, and this time there was none of the cold authority of a kingpin in his posture, only a man standing there with all his wounds laid bare. He did not stop her, did not use money or power to hold her as he once had. He only looked at her with eyes that had lost all their sharpness, and said he knew no words could make up for what his empire had done to her family. He said that in his whole life, he had never once truly apologized to anyone, because apology was something he had always considered a sign of weakness. But now, standing before her, he was sorry not because he wanted to keep her, but because she and her father deserved to hear that apology, because now, more than ever, he truly saw the pain he had spread, and he was disgusted by the man he had been. He said she had every right to hate him, every right to walk out through that door and never return, and he would respect that choice no matter how deeply it hurt him, because he had come to understand, late but honestly, that loving someone did not mean keeping them imprisoned beside him, but giving them the freedom to choose. Maeve stood in silence, listening to that confession, and for the first time she saw the most powerful man in New York completely lay down his armor, standing before her not as a monster or a kingpin, but as a human being in real pain and real remorse. And in that moment, amid the violent pull inside her heart, Maeve realized that the decision she was about to make would not only determine her own fate, but also answer the question of whether a lost soul truly deserved one chance to be saved. Maeve stood in the vast grand hall for a long time after Cassius's confession, her old cloth bag still clutched tightly in her hand, and in that silence she weighed everything, the pain of the past and the sincerity of the present, the monster he had once been and the human being standing before her now, trembling and bare in his remorse. She realized that for the first time since entering this world, she was truly free, no chain still binding her, no money, no favor, no threat. He had returned to her the full right to choose, and precisely because she was truly free, her decision carried its full meaning. She thought of Father Brennan, and what he had said about forgiveness as the noblest choice, thought of the orphaned child who had once trembled with hunger and cold, thought of the way Cassius had pulled himself back from rage, simply because she had begged him to, and she understood that people were not forever defined by the mistakes of the past if they truly wanted to change. And then, instead of walking out the door, Maeve set the cloth bag down on the stone floor, lifted her eyes to his, and said she chose to stay, not because she had forgotten what had happened to her father, but because she believed the man behind that shell of steel deserved a chance to atone, and because she did not want to abandon the small light that had just begun to glow inside a soul that had been submerged in darkness for too long. In that moment, something inside Cassius broke open, and he stepped toward her and held her for the first time not with possession, but with all the tenderness he had believed he had lost long ago. But that fragile peace did not last long, because that very evening an emergency call came crashing in. The remnants of the Vanderlyn family, desperate after their plot had failed and Silas had fallen into Cassius's hands, had decided to strike with one last cruel move. They had found the nursing home where Maeve's father was receiving treatment and were on their way there to abduct him, to turn him into a hostage and force Maeve to surrender her blood. Maeve panicked, her face going deathly pale as she thought of her sick, helpless father becoming a target. But this time she was not alone, and Cassius, without a second of hesitation, immediately mobilized the full weight of his vast resources and network of power. But what stunned Maeve was the way he acted. He did not plunge into bloody revenge the way his old self would have done, but used power with calculation and restraint. He sent his people to secure the nursing home, while coordinating with the legitimate contacts he had quietly built to stop the plot, neutralizing Vanderlyn's men before they could come anywhere near her father, and turning the remaining leaders over to the law, along with every piece of evidence tied to their criminal network. When word came back that her father was completely safe, Maeve collapsed against Cassius's shoulder and sobbed, and this time her tears were not tears of despair, but of relief and deep gratitude. Because she had seen with her own eyes, this man used the very strength that had once spread suffering to now protect the most precious thing in her life. A few days later, when everything had settled, Cassius brought Maeve back to St. Cecilia's church, and in Father Brennan's presence, he spoke a promise that both the old priest and Maeve knew was the greatest turning point of his life. He promised that he would begin dismantling the underworld empire he had built, step by step, that he would move the entire harbor operation onto a lawful path, that he would use his enormous wealth to compensate and help the very families his organization had once harmed, beginning with people like Maeve's father, to atone for at least a part of the layered sins of the past. Father Brennan, his eyes wet with tears, placed a hand on both their shoulders and said he had waited for this moment for decades, that redemption was never too late as long as a person still dared to choose the light. And amid all the warmth slowly coming back to life, another piece of good news arrived. Greta, the loyal housekeeper, who had bled while protecting Maeve on that night of terror, had passed the point of danger after days of careful treatment and was slowly recovering. And when Maeve came to her bedside and took her hand, the two women looked at each other and smiled through tears, understanding that everything they had endured together had finally carried them to the shore of peace. The harsh winter finally passed, giving way to the warm rays of spring stretching across the waters of Oyster Bay. And with that turning of the season, Maeve Donnelly's life also opened onto an entirely new page. Though Cassius had a vast fortune and was willing to give her anything she could possibly want, Maeve still chose to return to the path she had once been forced to abandon. She enrolled again to complete the final semester of her nursing program, and she did it not through privileges or doors opened in advance by money, but through her own effort and perseverance, staying up late and rising early to study, passing every exam with her own hands and her own mind. On the day she held the nursing degree she had dreamed of for so many years, pinning the tiny nightingale pin she had protected through the darkest days of her life onto her chest, Maeve understood that a person's dignity had never been, and would never be measured by wealth or power, but by the values they built with their own hands and the self-respect they preserved even when life drove them into a corner. Her father, Tobias, after months of careful treatment in the best possible conditions, had regained some of his strength. He could sit up and talk now, and smile the kind of smile Maeve had not seen on her father's face in a very long time. And then one day, Maeve brought Cassius to meet him, a meeting she both longed for and feared, because she did not know how the father who had once been driven into ruin by Cassius's own empire would react. Cassius, the man who had once made an entire city tremble, stood before the old man's bed with a humility no one had ever seen in him before. He bowed his head and sincerely apologized for all the suffering his organization had caused Tobias's family in the past, without evasion, without excuse, only the bare remorse of a man who truly wanted to atone. Tobias watched him in silence for a long while, then looked toward the pleading eyes of his daughter, and with all the forgiveness of a man who had walked nearly to the end of life and understood that hatred only chained the human heart to suffering, he slowly reached out his thin hand and took Cassius's, saying he chose to forgive. Not because what had been lost could ever be recovered, but because he did not want his daughter to keep living her life under the shadow of the past, and because he believed in the man his daughter had seen. In the moment, the hand of a father who had suffered so much held the hand of the man who had once spread that suffering. The circle of tragedy closed, and a new circle of healing and forgiveness opened, and Maeve stood there with tears running down her face, her heart filled with a peace she had thought she would never have. That evening, as the two of them stood together on the balcony, looking out over the bay glittering in the sunset, Cassius gently lifted Maeve's face, and in eyes where the old ice had completely melted, he gave her a kiss. Not the kiss of a powerful kingpin or a possessive man, but the tender and sincere kiss of a human being rescued by love and compassion from the abyss inside himself. She had once run into the fire to save a monster, but what she had pulled from the ashes that night turned out to be a man who had been lost for too long and had finally found his way home, through the light of a heart that never stopped believing in goodness. Maeve and Cassius's story leaves us with a profound lesson that a person's dignity is never measured by money or status, that compassion and kindness, no matter how small, still have the power to redeem even the darkest and most lost souls, and that forgiveness, though it may be the most difficult thing of all, is also the greatest strength that can free a person from the chains of hatred and the past. Every person we meet in this life carries a story, a private pain, and if we can learn to look at one another with understanding and humanity, we can kindle a ray of light in even the darkest days of life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video to help spread meaningful stories and hear more moving videos every day. How do you feel about Maeve and Cassius's story? Do you think forgiveness can truly heal the deepest wounds? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from the depths of your heart, because we are always eager to hear your voice. Thank you for spending your time listening until the very last moment. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, serenity, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next stories.